It's a tremendous honor to to be invited by the Mariners Museum to do this and to reconnect with Lyles. And he's had a love of maritime history going way back. And in honor of Hispanic Heritage Month, that means a great deal to me as well. I've had a love of the Spanish language really from childhood. So bienvenidos a todos, and let's get started. What I want to do is just give you a really quick and dirty flyover of Gulf of Mexico history, and then just hopefully whet your appetite for more, because it's as you can imagine, a vast topic that one can really not do justice to in a short lecture. So this will hopefully give you an appetite for what is on offer here. So Tim, if we could go to the next slide. And here we see our subject. This is the Gulf of Mexico, El Golfo de Mexico, Seno Mexicano, the Mexican breast, as it's sometimes called. It's actually considered a portion of the Atlantic basin more broadly, and as is the Caribbean. And some people think of the Gulf and the Caribbean really as one unit, or a bifurcation of one body of water. But here we see a map of the seafloor, the Gulf of Mexico, and you really get an extraordinary idea for how much of this basin is actually continental shelf. Something like 38% of it, as you can see, particularly off the continental United States there, Florida and along Louisiana and Texas, the shelf's quite wide. And then you have this deep central portion referred to as the Sigsbee Deep. But when I look at this sort of stepping back, it looks to me like some sort of sea creature arching down into the depths there of the deep. And its flukes would be the Florida Channel there between Florida and Cuba, and the Yucatan Channel between the west point of Cuba and the Yucatan Peninsula. And that's where water gushes in from the Caribbean and loops around in something called the loop current, and then blasts out through the Gulf Stream there, one of the, if not the fastest ocean current in the world, something like 4 knots. And really keeps the climate of Europe mild, and provides a handy highway for sailing craft, certainly in historic times, to sort of slingshot back to Europe. So we'll go to the next slide. And this is a quote by a woman named Freya Bremer, and she was a Swedish novelist during the mid-19th century, and she visited the United States in the 1850s and actually came up to the Gulf Coast out of Havana, which was a common route at that time via steamer. Havana to New Orleans or to Mobile was a routine run. And this was just something she wrote on the deck of a steamer midway across the Spanish Sea there. And she said the heavens with their soft white summer clouds arched themselves over the dark blue sea. And she just talks about how beautiful it was and how overwhelmed she was by the beautiful white puffy clouds and the cerulean sky and the deep blue sea. And I think that's a feeling that any mariner would share today, even from the deck of a modern fishing boat or a steel tanker. It's just an incredibly beautiful place. Let's take a look at the next slide. And here we can see a view of Orange Beach, Alabama. Alabama is not often thought of as a Gulf state, but it has something like 67 miles of waterfront there. And then, of course, Mobile Bay creates many, many hundreds more, indenting deeply into the interior with its magnificent river system. But Orange Beach is very close to the Florida line right there. And here we see a typical summer day. It's just incredibly beautiful. It's better than a visit to your therapist. Yeah, I think Henry James said it best. He said, when the sea doesn't give you trouble, it takes it away. You forget about telegrams and messages and obligations and all of those things. And we can feel the warmth of the sun on our bodies and that salty wind in our hair and our face. And it just takes it. You want to listen to Jimmy Buffett, who's from this area, by the way. So let's take a view of the next slide. Of course, famously, the sea will often give you trouble, and the Gulf in particular. This is a view of Hurricane Ivan at the Navarre Pier in Florida about 15 or 16 years ago. A terrible hurricane. It hit as a category 3 or 4. And you can just see the power of those waves, just phenomenal. In fact, I heard an actor, I forget which particular actor it was, but he talked about flying over the Gulf in Hurricane Hunter during Hurricane Ivan and looking down on these monstrous waves mid-Gulf. And he was with Laird Hamilton, the famous surfer, happened to be on the flight, and they were looking down, and this actor is just thinking, "Oh my God!" And Hamilton's trying to figure out, how can I go down there and surf those waves? In fact, the U.S. Navy measured, I believe, one of the tallest ocean waves ever in the Gulf of Mexico during Ivan. It was something like 90 feet high. Recall that scene from what was the movie? Perfect Storm, just that incredible wall of water. So just a incredibly frightening experience. Let's go to the next slide. Thankfully, we're almost through this hurricane season. The old mariners used to say, June too soon, July, stand by, August, you must, September, you'll remember, October, all over. So once we start to get those cold fronts dropping down, the danger lessens, the Gulf cools, and the drier air gives it less to feed on. There's another meteorological phenomenon in the Gulf that's really just as notorious and famous as hurricanes, and that's northers, or nortes in Espanol, or blue northers in Texican. And these are those Arctic cold fronts that blast through in the winter, typically in January, February, and March. They can lower the temperature 25 or 30 degrees in a matter of an hour. The wind can just be banging away. Libby Custer, who was stationed in Galveston with her husband, George Armstrong Custer, right after the Civil War, said that it was a fury indescribable. They got caught in a norther out in the Gulf when they were going back to New Orleans for his next assignment. And they just, they build the sea up into these mountainous waves. It's very unpleasant to be out there in the middle of one. And yet you have these beautiful sunsets, just this watery sky. And this, of course, is a famous American painter, Thomas Moran, who got caught in one while going from Havana to Tampico, Mexico. And so this was the result. He produced this beautiful painting. We go to the next slide. There's all kinds of flora and fauna, of course, around the Gulf, and the landscapes of the Gulf Coast are particularly distinctive. They're incredibly moody and evocative and rich. And these are just some of the trees that decorate the Gulf Coast. Really all around. That top right view is Havana, Cuba, La Habana, and those are palm trees, which are common all around the rim. You'll find them in Galveston and Mobile and New Orleans, and Tampico and the Yucatan. So it's a ubiquitous tree. And then the top center is the mangrove, which is common in Southwest Florida and is, even with climate change beginning to march north, they've actually found some examples on the barrier islands off the Mississippi Gulf Coast. And it's on the East Coast, it's as far north now as Jacksonville. Walking trees, some people call them, and you can see why. And then top left is the live oak, which we're so fond of here on the central Gulf Coast. Cities like Mobile and New Orleans have these just magnificent oak canopies over the streets, and the antebellum homes interspersed between them and festooned with Spanish moss. And you know you're where you are on the map. There's just no mistaking it for any place else. And then at the bottom, just a beautiful sunset view of cypress trees in a Louisiana swamp, again, draped with moss, and just these incredibly painterly sunsets that we enjoy here at all times of the year. Let's go to the next view. Of course, the Gulf is full of sea life, and these are just some common examples. Manatees at the top left are probably the crowd favorite, them and dolphins, the Atlantic bottlenose dolphins. Anytime you go out, even in a small boat, the dolphins will show up, and they're just born characters, great comedians, and terrific fun to watch it work. At top right, all kinds of sharks and skates and rays inhabit the Gulf. Blue crab at lower right is a famous denizen of the coastal waters around here. And in fact, Mobile Bay anglers like to turn them into West Indies salad, which is one of Mobile's contributions to the American culinary pantry. And then red snapper, of course, bottom center, probably the greatest tasting fish to come out of the Gulf. Really just a wonderful, wonderful resource. And then in 2020, that year of wonders and horrors, here at the lower left, we have a 30-ton sperm whale, female sperm whale, that of all things was stranded in Mobile Bay. I don't know historically of another account of that ever happening. Typically 1 to 2 will strand somewhere along the northern coast every year or so. But this was the first time in memory one actually got into the bay. It was alive. It was swimming up the bay. It got about halfway up. It was deep enough, but distressed. And unfortunately, it had to be euthanized. And here you see the folks at the Dauphin Island Sea Lab bringing it in for an autopsy. So a sad episode, but it was just amazing. It drew crowds down to the, Melville talks in that opening scene of Moby Dick, how people are drawn to the sea, and at sunset particularly, they'll go down to the piers and the walkways in the Manhattoes. And it was like that here. People, every little public pier were thronged with binoculars, hoping to catch a glimpse. So next slide. Of course, human history began many thousands of years ago in the Gulf Basin. The Gulf was fully formed geologically and geographically recognizable as we know it today, 3,000 to 5,000 years ago. And in my book, there was no way that I could do justice to the diversity and range of Native American peoples that have called the Gulf Basin home over the millennia. So I concentrated on 3 that I thought really showed a remarkable interdependency with the sea life, and learned how to cooperate with it and live with it, and as well as their unique environment. One, of course, were the Calusa down in Southwest Florida, and that's a view. Those upper 2 slides are typical of Calusa culture. The top left is a painting. They inhabited a lot of the areas down around West Charlotte Harbor, Florida today, down toward the Keys. They built shell mounds, typically like a lot of the Mississippian peoples. And this was, of course, before the conquistadors arrived and ruined everything. But the Calusa actually had a sophisticated canal network. They would cut islands in 2 with canals to shorten their routes. And they had these seaside villages with elaborate stilt houses. And of course, they subsisted off the sea and grew to be quite a large population, probably something like 10,000, as many as that environment would effectively support. And then they just were wonderful artists and craftsmen, as you can see by this pelican head. Of course, pottery at the top right was common to all the native peoples, incredibly functional, but also decorative. And then one of the other native peoples I look at are the Maya, who occupied the Yucatan, Guatemala, the southern part of Mexico. And that lower left is an actual lighthouse that the Maya built, again, before the Spanish entradas. And the Maya had also a great deal of marine trade going on locally among their islands and along their coasts and rivers. And they had these large double-ended canoes with high prows and sterns. They actually pegged these pieces to the ends of their dugouts with high prows and sterns that allowed them to manage a little better with a following or a head sea. And they would use these lighthouses by day to mark channels. They would have signalers there with colorful banners. At night, they could have torches to really help guide their mariners home. Columbus famously encountered a canoe load of Maya during his second voyage to the New World in the Gulf of Honduras. And he talked about how the canoe was something like 8 feet wide. Imagine the size of that log. And that they actually had a big flat platform in the center where the women and children were seated. And they were carrying all kinds of trade items. They used cocoa beans for money, which amazed the Spaniards, obsessed as they were with gold and silver. And the Indians, they described the clothing they had, the shirts and the various goods and weapons that they had. And so here are these 2 alien peoples who've never encountered each other before, these bearded Spaniards in their caravellas, and these Native Americans in their colorful shirts on this dugout canoe, and how the world would change after those years. And then the bottom right, I look at the Mississippian peoples, the mound cultures around the central Gulf Coast, Pensacola, Mobile, Florida. They built these earthen mounds and had a very, very sophisticated agricultural culture, but they too used dugout canoes to trade widely with one another. In fact, visitors in the 18th century, like William Bartram, the American naturalist, said that they would even travel to as far as Cuba from Florida for tobacco and trade goods like that, or over to the Bahamas. So you look at a dugout canoe and you think, my God, who in their right mind would get in the water in that, not to mention in a choppy sea. Yet the Indians were expert and adroit handlers. And the Spanish talked about how when the Indians would flip the canoe, if they got flipped over, how it was of no consequence, that the Indians immediately worked together to sort of upright the canoe and shake the water out of it and flip it over and jump right back in. And it was simply a matter of seconds. So they were, though they did not appear to use sails that we've been able to find any evidence of, they traveled apparently quite widely and traded quite widely. Shells, lightning whelks from Florida and Alabama waters have been found as far north as Cahokia, Illinois. And it was actually more efficient to transfer and trade via canoe than on foot. Somebody's even figured out how many calories people on land would burn, say, going from the Gulf Coast to Cahokia as opposed to paddling in a dugout canoe. And it was just much easier and more efficient by water. We go to the next slide. Of course, all of that Native American universe would be irreparably destroyed and upended as a result of the European contact. And here we see some of the most famous world figures involved in that. Ferdinand and Isabella. Ferdinand was the King of Aragon and Isabel de Castile, and they united the Spanish crown and really began the beginnings of the Spanish nation as we know it. They ejected the Moors. Spain completed its Reconquista, the ejection of the Moorish peoples and the reconquest of Spain by the Christian faith. Jews were forced to convert or leave as well, the conversos. And then at the right, we see Christopher Columbus, who was actually a Genoan merchant, but he had this idea of how to get to the Indies. And he felt that sea was the most logical route. Many people knew about the land route, but it was arduous, it was long, it was dangerous. There were bandits, there were tolls. It was just very difficult. Columbus felt that by sailing west, he could come to the Indies. The earth was round after all, though not all his sailors believed that. And so he was actually able to obtain the funding from Ferdinand and Isabella to discover the New World. And of course, that's a famous story. Columbus never got into the Gulf of Mexico. He discovered Cuba, which he thought was a peninsula rather than an island. In fact, he forced his men to sign a statement that it was a peninsula and not an island, at the peril of having their tongues cut out and being fined 10,000 maravedis. And that was because he didn't want what he was finding to conflict with his medieval worldview. He thought he was in Asia already. He thought that Cuba was perhaps Japan or perhaps part of China, and he was looking for monkey men and people with tails. And the Indians were just saying, well, if you want to believe that, fine, but this is an island. And Columbus couldn't accept it, so he never sailed around the western tip of Cuba. And in fact, when he felt the current, the Yucatan current pulling him that way, he reversed course back to Jamaica. So he would not be the first Spaniard to penetrate the Gulf. That honor would fall to Sebastian Ocampo, who in 1508 actually circumnavigated Cuba, proved that it was an island, and actually discovered what would eventually become Havana and its magnificent harbor. So the next shot. And of course, this is the vessel that really made it all possible, the Caravella. You can see on the left is this reproduction vessel, and it's a lateen rig, which was typical in the Mediterranean. And then for crossing the Atlantic, where you have those trade winds that just blow day after day consistently, they converted the Caravella to what they call the Caravella Redonda, or the rounded Caravella. And that was because when these square sails were billowed out, they looked round. And here we see a vessel that's still got the lateen rig on its two masts at the stern, but the main mast and the foremast are square rigged. And so that enabled them to just set the sails and ride the trades clear across the Atlantic. And then once they got in the Caribbean and then the Gulf, were maneuvering along coasts. These vessels would only draw 6 or 7 feet, so they could get in quite close. They could penetrate bays and harbors and rivers and things like that, shallow areas. they could use those lateen sails to maneuver very effectively. So it was a beautifully designed vessel to conquer the particular environments that they were facing. And there's a wonderful section of Admiral of the Ocean Sea, that just wonderful book by Samuel Eliot Morison, that biography of Columbus. There's a whole chapter on the caravels and how they were rigged and sailed and navigated. And he talks about how, when modern, of course, he wrote that in the 40s, but I think people still think that when they see these things. Periodically we'll have replicas of the Nino or the Pinta or the Santa Maria come around. There were some in Mobile Bay not long ago, and they come right up to the city or to Fairhope without any problem. And people look at those and think, God, it's sail across the Atlantic, and it's a cockle shell. And Morison really gave the lie to that. He said, these vessels were sailed by men who were confident and brave, and they were well captained. Yes, their navigation was primitive and would give a modern sailor the heebie-jeebies, but they knew what they were doing, and these vessels were extraordinarily seaworthy. And of course, many would be lost and many lives would be lost, but the project of exploration was really able to advance because of excellence in the beautiful design and utility of these vessels. My kitty keeps intruding on me here a little bit, so pardon that. We'll go to the next view. There were numerous entradas around the coast. In Cuba was conquered in the early 1500s. Of course, Florida and the Yucatan and Mexico. So I just wanted to highlight a few of these that were of particular consequence to the Gulf. Panfilo de Narvaez and Cabeza de Vaca, of course, perhaps one of the most notable. They land in the 15 teens in roughly what's Tampa Bay, and then proceeded by land up into the Appalachian country and what we call the Big Bend of Florida. And Cabeza de Vaca was actually a scribe with the expedition. He wrote a memoir about it, which is very famous. There have been movies made about him, though he's still, I think, underappreciated in American history, just the scale of his achievement. But Narvaez Las Casas, the famous priest and advocate for the American Indians, referred to Narvaez as cruel and stupid, and that was a pretty good description. He liked to abuse the Indians, and he was only interested in gold and silver, and running them down. And so they just cut a swath through Florida, and of course the Indians were extremely hostile to them. They didn't appreciate having their women raped or their people taken as bearers and their crops ruined and given over to these vagabonds. And so it became very difficult for Narvaez. The countryside wore him out. He abandoned his fleet, and then the men were basically starving by the time they reached the northern portion of Florida. So they built these vessels, these big barges there, what they called the Bay of Horses, and put to sea and sort of bounced along the littoral. Cabeza de Vaca. The name means cow's head. It's an unusual name. It's a family name, actually. There was an early ancestor who helped guide the Christians through a pass against the Moors, and to mark the pass, he had put a cow skull, and hence that sort of became the family's honored designation. But Cabeza de Vaca was in charge of one of these barges. There'd been like 5 of them, maybe 50 or 60 people in each one. And, just people were attacked by Indians or shipwrecked or starved or were lost all along the way until they got to what's essentially modern Galveston, and the waves threw them on the beach. And Cabeza de Vaca and 3 other men survived and essentially walked from there all the way to the Pacific coast across Mexico, when they bumped into some slave runners and were able to go back to New Spain and tell their incredible story. And it is an amazing odyssey. It's just a magnificent. And de Vaca, incredibly for a conquistador, I don't think he ever killed an Indian, and he never said anything bad about them. And in fact, during this trip, they even had a black man with them who was Esteban, who was the slave of one of the men. They all were thought to have healing powers by the Indians, and they would do incantations and help the Indians. And sometimes they were enslaved by certain tribes. Other times they were kicked around or forced to work. And then other times they were honored as shamans or healers. And it's just an amazing story. I can hardly do it justice here, but incredibly rich and worth your attention. So the next slide. Of course, Hernando Cortez and Ponce de Leon, very famous. Cortez, of course, invades Mexico in 1519, conquers it with an incredibly small force, but and a huge number of Native American allies. And sometimes I think that's underappreciated by lay people. Cortez really couldn't have done it with just 400 or 500 conquistadors. He really depended on Native American help because there were a lot of alliances within the Mexican empire that he was able to exploit, rivalries, groups that didn't care for the Aztecs and didn't like sending their children to Mexico City to be sacrificed and so forth. So he really, though, was a force of nature. And his confrontation with Montezuma, world famous, I'm sure many of you perhaps are familiar with or have read Prescott's Invasion of Mexico and Peru, one of the great American literary classics and just an incredible odyssey. Of course, Ponce would discover Florida, land on it in 1513, probably somewhere around Charlotte Harbor, maybe Tampa. Some people say as far as Pensacola, but not real sure, probably in the mangrove coast somewhere. And the story that he was looking for the Fountain of Youth, unfortunately, and I say that because I'm a native Floridian and I love the story, and I like the idea that there's a Fountain of Youth out there somewhere. Ponce, the mention of the fountain as the inspiration for his voyage didn't come till a number of years later. But he landed in Florida, got reinforcements in Cuba, went back to colonize, and of course, he too was belligerent and fought with the Indians and got a poisoned thigh, rather a poisoned arrow in his thigh for his trouble, and was ferried back to Cuba and died. So he met the end of many conquistadors. Those who live by the sword die by the sword. There was some archaeology, in fact, Jim Delgado that Julie was quoting earlier, they put a great thing on their website a couple of years ago on April Fool's Day. They had a picture of some cattle in a Florida field with some live oaks looming over them. And they said, scientists have discovered that these cattle have DNA that's 500 years old. These cattle who live by this pond are 500 years old. And this is, and everybody's going, what, 500-year-old cows? And they were saying that, well, this is the fountain of youth that Ponce was looking for. So it made a great April Fool's joke. Next slide. One of the first Spaniards to really probe the northern Gulf Coast and penetrate Mobile Bay was Alvarez de Pineda. And he produced a map in 1519. This is one of the earlier maps of the Gulf, not the earliest, but you can see, though crude, you can see Cuba and the Yucatan, and the basic geography is there. He too was looking for gold, but they were looking for the Northwest Passage as their way to the Pacific Ocean, and again to the Indies, the spices, the goods that everybody was wild to get from China and Japan. And so Pineda actually sailed the entire littoral in both directions. He left from Jamaica, went up all along the coast and explored Galveston and Mobile Bay and the Mississippi River. He did not, as far as we can tell, penetrate the Mississippi because it has just that prodigious current, but he experienced its outflow and was aware that it was what he called the Rio del Espíritu Santo, the river of the Holy Spirit. So that map is an important landmark in Gulf cartography. And the next slide. Of course, Hernando de Soto lands in either Charlotte or Tampa Bay in 1539. And here we see a rather romanticized view, the teepees, hardly what you would have found among the Gulf peoples at that time. And of course, Soto would carve a murderous path through the Southeast down something like 7 or 8 southern states before dying and being buried in the Father of Waters himself and his men fleeing in homemade brigantines down the Mississippi River back to New Spain, 300 or so fewer than when they had left. The next slide. What I find interesting about Soto is his wife, Isabel de Bobadilla, and they married in 1537. They traveled to Cuba for his entrada to Florida. And he, of course, was the governor of Cuba. And so while he was absent, he made her the governor of Cuba in his stead. And she's the first and to date only female governor of Cuba. Of course, Cuba would be a Spanish colony until the Spanish-American War in 1898. And here we see an image of her top left, and then top right, we see the entrance to Havana Harbor, El Morro. There on the opposite shore, you can see with the lighthouse. Many of you will recognize that landmark. But in the foreground, there's a little tower there with a dome, and there's a little figure that you can see on top of it, and that's called La Giraldilla, She Who Turns, and it's a sculpture that was originally placed in the early 1630s, and legend has long associated with Isabel, because the story is that she was anxiously waiting for her husband to return, and when the fleet returned and said that Soto had actually been killed at a place and buried in the, or died rather of fever, and been buried in the Mississippi, she supposedly wandered around in grief and died of her sorrow. We, of course, know that wasn't the case. She was a shrewd businesswoman who was able to recollect herself afterwards, and in fact returned to Spain and died a few years later. But it makes a lovely legend, and legends die hard in the Gulf, as I guess they do everywhere. But La Giraldilla, this little wind vane at the top of that little tower, became associated with Isabel, and it was supposedly that represented her spirit waiting for her husband to return. The connection to the central Gulf Coast, and here we see these bottom two slides. Bottom left, that's Dauphin Island off Mobile Bay, and then the bottom right are some fig trees. The story is, according to a couple of legends, she actually came with Maldonado, the Spanish admiral, to wait for her husband in Pensacola and Mobile, in that area. And one particularly colorful raconteur said that she would wander the beaches of Dauphin Island crying for her husband, and that she planted the fig trees that are on the island today. So she's remembered on Dauphin Island, even though there's no evidence that she ever went there. There's an Isabel Point, there's an Isabel Drive. So I find that particularly charming. Next view. Of course, wonderful cartography would follow in the wake of a lot of this exploration. And here we see a map deeply informed by the Soto expedition. It's really the first European map to show the interior of the native Southeast, and you can see the various towns and rivers represented. It's still very crude, but the Appalachians are there, the Mississippi is there, Mobile Bay, the other bays. Tuscaloosa is shown as well, named after a prominent native chief, and it's just a beautiful, beautiful map. The next view. And here we can see a view of Cuba, which would be so important, a Spanish possession for so long. Havana was really the key to the Indies. It was called, very important for trade. And of course, with that Yucatan current and then the Gulf Stream, you got this incredible natural highway for sailing craft. And so the Spanish treasure fleets, the flotas as they were called, would reunite at Havana. That, you know, they had the Manila galleon would come over from the Indies to, or rather from Asia to the Pacific coast, and they'd ferry the silver and the porcelains and the silks and the coffees and the other delicacies across the Mexican landmass. And then at Veracruz, they would take them on board ships to Havana. And then the silver fleet coming out of the Caribbean would weather at Havana Harbor as well. And then they would reunite there and then sail across to Europe, feeling there was more protection in numbers. And so the Gulf Stream just gave them an incredibly natural advantage in getting around. So phenomenal wealth would come out of the Spanish Sea. And of course, with that would come people who wanted to plunder it, pirates and ne'er-do-wells and colorful figures. The next slide. Havana, of course, which I've mentioned, I spent a lot of time in the book talking about it. It's so important. It's a lovely city. It's a credible city, wonderful people. Here you can see a map at the top left. I mean, you see that deeply pocketed harbor that it has, which was such a terrific advantage for shipping at that time. And then at the lower left, we see some steam shipping coming in through the Morro right there at the entrance to Havana Harbor. And then that right image is an advertisement for cigars. Of course, Havana, famous for its tobacco, Cuba famous for its tobacco. You can't go anywhere in Havana without smelling cigar smoke. It's ubiquitous. And yes, women did and still do smoke cigars. Of course, the members of the George Sand Society would approve. Next view. Of course, Veracruz is the other really important Hispanic city in the Gulf Basin. It's on the Gulf Coast of Mexico. Historically, one of the more important cities in the basin, founded by Cortez, 1519. So like Havana, half a millennia old. Here we see an 1860s view of it, and you can see it's got a wall around it. You'll see that little round structure to the right on the landward side. That's a bull ring, so entertainment was certainly not neglected. And then that little island directly offshore has a stone fortress that dates to the 16th century, and that really protected the harbor of Veracruz. So Veracruz was a very important jump-off point for the treasure fleets of it, as I've mentioned, and it did a great deal of trade as well. Next slide. Of course, the Spanish would not hold their sea inviolate for long. The French penetrated in the 17th century, and here we see a view of Lasalle, who came down the Mississippi River, penetrated it all the way to the Gulf, and here we see him erecting a column and claiming the vast Mississippi Valley for France. What the French wanted to do was control the Mississippi River Valley and threaten the Spanish treasure fleets and the Spanish silver mines in Mexico. And they felt that a perch on the central Gulf Coast would give them the ideal opportunity and position to do that. Then they could also dominate the fur trade of the Mississippi Valley. And additionally, they could have settlements up and down the valley and into Canada, and hem in the British on the eastern seaboard. So that was their grand strategy. The Spanish referred to the French settlement there at Mobile and New Orleans as the French thorn. They were determined to remove it, but the French were more interested in the rivers than the Gulf proper, and they would really be the dominant force in the Mississippi Valley for the next many, many decades. Next view. The cartography of the French era is especially beautiful. I love this map. It's 1747. It shows the central Gulf Coast, and you'll instantly recognize the Mississippi River and the Birdfoot Delta off Louisiana, Mobile Bay right there in the center, and the Florida Panhandle and the Big Bend. And it shows the 10-fathom curve there. The 60-foot depth limit is that heavy green line just off the coast. So that was of immense importance to mariners, because they knew once you get across that point, you're going to be looking at shallower waters and bays, and you better have an old salt in the chains with a lead line who can sort of throw the line and determine the depth of the water so you don't run aground, because some of those larger 18th century seagoing ships could draw as much as 20 feet. So getting into bays and harbors that might be deep but have shallow bars at the mouths could be quite treacherous if you didn't know where the channels were. Lead line is what I'm trying to think of. So next view. Of course, French culture on the Gulf Coast is just fascinating, the subject of limitless films and tourism appeal and great cuisine and music and all kind of stuff. And of course, New Orleans is most famous, but it's actually a little younger than Mobile. Mobile founded in 1702. New Orleans about 1718, top left, New Orleans, top right, Mobile, both right on the river. Very important for communication, both out to sea and into the interior as well. Building alliances with those Indian tribes was all important. And then the lower left is a 1930s photograph of the pirogue, which is a very common conveyance among the French, incredibly practical. You could add a little mast in the center for a sail and strakes to prevent splash in a chop. And it was an incredibly versatile craft. Lafitte's pirates used them constantly for smuggling, and they would really, you'll still see them today, often with little kicker motors on them. The joke was that if you switched your tobacco chew from one side of the mouth to the other, you were in danger of capsizing your pirogue. So they take a good deal of balance and skill to master. And then, of course, Creole architecture at the lower right image, we see those Creole houses in places like Mobile, New Orleans, Biloxi as well. Of course, cuisine, gumbo is a famous amalgamation of Gulf cultures. Everyone contributed, the Native Americans, the Europeans, the Germans added sausage. They settled a portion of the Mississippi River called the German Coast, north of the city. and rice. Africans brought rice and rice culture that they were familiar with from Africa. And so Gulf Coast truly is a blending of all the cultures in the region. I should briefly explain what Creole is. Creole is originally was a term that denoted a child born of European parents in the Indies, in the colonies. But it would quickly come to have more complex meanings in places like the Central Gulf Coast. It often had racial overtones and still does today. Creoles were often the children of white planters, Spanish or French planters who had married or at least had children with their Black concubines, or in sometimes cases free Black women, or they freed their slaves and in some cases legitimately married them. The Latin powers would end up being much more racially tolerant than the American that followed. The next slide. Of course, the Battle of New Orleans, famous. I hope you've all seen the movie The Buccaneer with Charlton Heston and Yul Brynner as Jean Lafitte's great movie from the 50s. Here we see some representations. That's Lafitte top left, Dominic Yu, who is one of his captains, top center, Jackson top right, and of course the Battle of New Orleans at the bottom. I'm going to blow past that because I think I'm running short on time, and I apologize for this, but you see how incredibly rich this culture and tradition and history is. And so hopefully this is giving you at least a sense of that. Next image. One of the really truly international stories of the last couple of years was the discovery of the slave ship Clotilde in the Mobile River, just north of the city of Mobile, by an ex-newspaper reporter named Ben Raines. He's got a book coming out in the spring called The Last Slave Ship, I think is the name of it. But it's about his odyssey to really find that wreck. It was a result of a bet. It was a topsail schooner built in Mobile. Its owner was a notorious racist, like unfortunately many people were at that time, but he wanted to defy the federal government. This was a capital crime. He wanted to prove he could import slaves into Mobile without getting caught, without paying any consequence. So he commissioned this ship that he owned, Clotilde, hired a captain, and sent her on a voyage across the Atlantic to what's now Benin. They loaded 110 African captives and brought them back and distributed them. And this was right before the Civil War. The lower left, you'll see an image of the wreck. It's right along the bank of the Mobile River. It's submerged in anywhere from 5 to 20 feet of water. They think it could be as much as 70% intact. A great deal of the keel and hull is probably still there. There should be evidence of the slave beds that they built down beneath the deck, the timber. They carried lumber on her deck to disguise her purpose going across, and then the crew hammered it together into slave beds, and those ought to still be in evidence, if not manacles and other evidence of that voyage. And then the bottom right's the National Geographic artist representation of the voyage. The next slide. What's really inspirational too about the story of the Clotilde is that many of those descendants still live in that part of Mobile today, an area known as Africatown or African Town in the 19th century. The top left is Cujo Lewis, who was one of the last slaves to die. He died in the 1930s, and he arrived in Alabama probably as a teenager. He was probably 13 or 14 years old when he got here. And then, of course, alongside him is Zora Neale Hurston, who famously interviewed him in Mobile and wrote a book called Barracoon, which was only published a year or so ago. Really a phenomenal story about his odyssey of being captured and brought to Mobile. And then at top right, you'll see him with two of his grandchildren. And then these images at the bottom are some of the descendants of the Africatown slaves in the Mobile area today. And they've really been wonderful to work with, and they have been very interested in this story, and they've really helped bring it to life in an important way. Some of you may have seen Henry Louis Gates's Finding Your Roots a while back, where he had Questlove, the musician, and it turns out Questlove is actually an Africatown descendant. And Gates said, you know, you're one of the few African Americans in this country who can say where he came from in Africa, the name of the ship that he came across on, and the name of the place where he arrived. And that's almost unique in African-American culture. So these people are incredibly proud of that heritage and tradition, and how the Clotilde will be excavated going forward, how that story will be told is really going to be fascinating to follow. Next image. Of course, the Civil War would put paid to slavery, and it's an incredibly rich and complex topic in the basin. Of course, Farragut and the blockade, the battles of New Orleans and Mobile Bay, famous. There was only one blue water duel in the Gulf off Galveston, and that was between the CSS Alabama, Raphael Semmes, and the USS Hatteras here on the left. It was a nocturnal duel. The gunfire was audible for miles, the orange flashes visible on the horizon from shore. The Hatteras was sunk, 5 of her crew killed, the rest captured and paroled in Jamaica. And Semmes proved that he could pretty much go anywhere he wanted with impunity. Next slide. Of course, the violent history of the Gulf is very long and sometimes unfortunate. Veracruz has been besieged 4 times in its history. They call it cuatro veces heroica, 4 times heroic. Top left, you'll see during the Mexican War. Bottom left, during an era of gunboat diplomacy right before World War I. Of course, the explosion of the Maine and Havana Harbor, and then Nazi U-boat activity. There you see it lower right in the Gulf, was quite a story. And of course, there are books about all these things. I talk about them all somewhat in my book, and they're just incredible episodes and remarkably colorful as well. Next slide. A lot of scientific enterprise in the Gulf. This is the Sigsbee sounding machine at the top center, which looks like a cross between a guillotine and a bicycle. And it was meant to measure really deep water. It had a weight that was dropped. It's like a 60-pound weight, and then it could be reeled in on a steel drum by steam power. Top left is Charles Sigsbee, who commanded this voyage to survey the Gulf thoroughly. Top right is Alexander Agassiz, who was the scientist on board. And bottom left is the schooner, the Blake. This was in the 1870s. And then the bottom right is the bathymetric map of the Gulf of Mexico they produced. And this was the first bathymetric map of any ocean basin in the world. So it's extremely important for that fact. And there again, you can see that distinctive deep sea creature shape in the center there. So let's go to the next slide. Of course, container shipping, containerized shipping was developed in Mobile by a guy named Malcolm McLean. And that's just wrought a revolution in world trade, certainly made ports less interesting in terms of local color. Top is Mobile, bottom is Tampa Bay. But you'll see just the immense quantity of material these vessels can carry. But the docks are now these vast aprons of concrete with these towers and trucks and trains. It's all automated. The vast gangs of singing stevedores are gone. You've got one guy up in a tower with computerized equipment, and his, one hand he dips into a bag of Cheetos, and the other one he's maneuvering tons of boxes on and off ships quite nimbly, like a giant would pluck them off the deck. It's an amazing story. Next slide. And I really want to close with again the idea of people and the importance of people and Gulf culture and the importance of the water and the sea to their lifeways. This is a little girl down in Isle de Jean Charles, Louisiana, taken a few years ago. And she's a member of the Biloxi Chitimacha Choctaw tribe, many of whom had ancestors that would have worked with feet, shown him the ways through the various bayous and so forth in the 19th century. They are a Native American group. They're very small, only 100 or so members. What's significant about them is because of sea level change, because of the oil and gas canals and climate change and so forth, they've actually been forced back from their waterfront abodes, and the federal government's relocated them up near Houma, Louisiana, to the tune of something like $50 million. And I think we may be seeing more of this in the future, but it's really a significant change in their lifeways. They insisted that their new position, though, have water or a bayou because it's so critical to their sense of identity. And here you can see her pier is really her front yard, and just that vast landscape behind her, so distinctive. And I think the next slide is our last one. And once again, I just want to thank you all so much for this opportunity. I love to talk about the Gulf. I hope I didn't stumble over my words too much. There's just so much to cover, but I hope it was enjoyable and not tedious, and that you'll be inspired to explore more on your own.
Hardly tedious, John. That was fabulous. I'm hungry now for red snapper and Mobile salad, that's for sure.
Let's go get some.
We would love it. And there are just so many similarities between where you live and where we are here in Virginia on our coastline with the port. And I used to think Jamestown was old in 1607, but you shared views of American culture that were a lot older than that. Well, not American, but native culture, which was fascinating. Tell us a little bit about Gulf Quest, since we are the Mariners Museum.
Yes.
Our big museum here in our parts. I was not familiar until I spoke with you and Lyles about Gulf Quest. Maybe give a little snippet about that for those that haven't been.
Sure, Julie, thanks so much. Yeah, Gulf Quest is the National Maritime Museum of the Gulf of Mexico. It's in Mobile, right off the interstate, easy to get to if you're coming along this stretch of coast. And it's not just a museum, it's really a showcase of modern shipping technology. They've got a replica of a container ship in there. There's a lot of interactive exhibits where you can operate a crane yourself and lift the containers off models of ships. They've got an amazing pilot simulator that Mobile Bay and bar pilots actually use to train on, that simulates the whole bay. You can travel up and down it and simulates different weather conditions, and has different landmarks along the coast. That's just a wonder. They have a massive globe that's digitized that has all the different weather around the world, and they can project shipping and where it's all going. And it's high tech and amazing and just a wonderful experience. And 2 hours will just vanish in there. It's a wonderful spot.
Well, it sounds like it. I appreciate you giving us a little tidbit on that, because I would love to visit it. Tell us what you're working on next.
No, I appreciate that. I'm doing a book about Havana and Mobile and their long history and association. Of course, you got a little taste of that with Soto and Isabel, but a lot of other figures as well. And I'm working with a couple of photographers, one American, one Cuban, and a Cuban architectural historian. We cooked it up in Havana a couple of years ago, pre-pandemic. I'm hoping to get back down there soon, preferably in the winter, which is a grand time to be in Havana, and carry that research forward a little further. They've offered to open their archives to me. And in fact, Cuban baseball briefly got it started in Mobile. There were 3 students from Havana who were at Spring Hill College, a Jesuit school here, during the American Civil War, and they were neutrals, so they couldn't serve. And they learned this wacky new game with a bat and a ball. And then after the war, they went back and formed the Havana Baseball Club. So it's just a cool story. And of course, William Gorgas, who would conquer yellow fever, was born in the Mobile area. And just on and on it goes. And of course, trade and travel was all common before the revolution in 1959. So it's been a lot of fun, and the people are just warm and wonderful. And we're hoping in the future, we are a sister city with Havana, and we're hoping in the future that our ties can be much warmer and closer.
Well, it sounds like a lovely city, and we appreciate your telling us more about it. We do have a question here from Douglas. Was the Acadian diaspora to Louisiana forced or voluntary? Did it significantly alter the existing culture of Louisiana?
Oh, absolutely. And Cajun would be the shorthand for the Acadians, the people from up Nova Scotia way and Canada who were forcibly evicted by the British, largely Catholic. And I'm sure some might have come voluntarily, perhaps later, but it was by and large a forced eviction. And their impact on Louisiana culture has really been profound. Zydeco music, many will know, cuisine, suck them crawfish heads, and they're wonderfully fun people to be around. They know how to have a good time, and a lot of Louisiana culture is broadly and popularly Cajun culture.
Mhm.
Many of them spoke in a type of patois well into the 20th century. I would think it would be harder now to find someone who didn't speak English back in the swamps, but might not have been so uncommon in the 1930s. And a particularly distinctive kind of dialect that a lot of them had. There was a comedian some years ago, some of the old salts might recognize, a guy named Justin Wilson. And he would talk in that kind of patois and tell funny stories. And you want to get a flavor of it, look up Justin Wilson on YouTube. I guarantee that was, well, General Honore of Katrina fame, I think had a good bit of that kind of culture
Yeah,
in his veins.
right, right. I remember that. Yes. Well, John, it's been an absolute pleasure, and we want you to come see us in Newport News. And I have to ask, I don't know, do we have a P-row in the International Small Craft Center, Lyles? I don't know, do we?
Actually, we do. It's a dugout P-row, and
Okay,
it's just as tippy as the built ones. I actually have one, and once you get it moving forward, it's actually more stable. But getting in and getting out is where you're gonna your greatest chance of falling in the water. So
well, I know what craft you're talking about now. I just didn't realize it was a P-row, but yes, that is one tippy looking thing. Yeah.
that one's actually carved from cypress wood. Beautiful grain. Yeah.
My
Well,
dad told a story briefly, if I can.
yes.
He went hunting with his father in the Mobile Delta back in the 30s, and they went to this little island that was covered in corn, and there was one little shack right there, and there was this old Cajun guy. I think we had Cajuns in the Mobile Bay area as well. This old Cajun guy there tending it, and my grandfather said he just had a little pirogue on the bank, and Pop said, "How do you get the corn from the island over to the mainland?" And the old Cajun just looked at him and winked and said, "In jugs."
Cheers.
Cheers.
And we appreciate your being with us, John. As Jenna has said, we will have your program up in about a week on YouTube for folks to share with others that weren't with us tonight. And we look forward to your coming to visit, John, and to your next book when it comes out. And with that, I don't see any other questions, but we appreciate all of you that joined us this evening, and have a great week, and look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.